It was Christmas Eve, and the air in my daughter Sarah's sprawling suburban home usually hummed with warmth and laughter. This year, however, it felt colder than the December wind rattling the windows. My chest felt tight, a familiar constriction that had become a constant companion these past few months. My hands, gnarled with age and years of honest work, trembled slightly as I tried to adjust the knot on my old tie, a gift from my late wife Mary. I could hear the cacophony of cheerful voices from the living room. My grandchildren Michael and Emily chasing each other, their parents, Sarah and her husband Daniel, attempting to wrangle them, and my son James and his wife Lisa chiming in with their own brand of sarcastic wit. I stood in the hallway, feeling like an uninvited specter, a ghost from a past they'd rather forget. The humiliation had started subtly, a series of sidelong glances and hushed whispers, evolving into outright dismissiveness. It began when I sold my house, the one Mary and I had built our life in, the one filled with memories that now felt too heavy to carry alone. The market was good, and I'd made a decent profit, enough to live comfortably, or so I thought. My children, with their well-meaning but ultimately self-serving advice, convinced me that I needed to downsize, to simplify. They'd found me a small, sterile apartment in an assisted living facility, far from my old neighborhood, far from my friends. "It's for your own good, Dad," Sarah had said, her voice dripping with an irritating sweetness. "You can't manage that big house anymore." The truth was, they saw my savings, not my solitude. Tonight the insults were sharper, less veiled. As I walked into the living room, trying to force a smile onto my weary face, James caught my eye. "Look who finally decided to grace us with his presence," he drawled, a smirk playing on his lips. Lisa snickered beside him, her perfectly coiffed head tilted in amusement. My jaw clenched, and I felt the familiar burn behind my eyes. I wanted to retort, to remind them of the countless sacrifices I'd made for them, the extra shifts I'd pulled, the dreams I'd put on hold. But the words caught in my dry throat. Dinner was a grand affair, as always. Turkey, ham, mashed potatoes, cranberry sauce, a feast that felt designed to mock my shrinking appetite. I sat at the end of the long dining table, a place of honor that now felt more like exile. Daniel, Sarah's husband, usually a man of few words, spoke up, his voice tinged with a condescending pity. "So, John, how's life at the facility? Still enjoying those early bird specials?" The thinly veiled jab about my age and dependence hit me harder than any outright insult. Emily, my usually quiet granddaughter, actually giggled. "Oh, Dad, don't worry," Sarah chimed in, her voice too loud, too cheerful. "We're just happy you're not a burden anymore. Living on your own at your age, it was getting precarious." My shoulders felt impossibly heavy. A burden. The word echoed in my mind, a cruel anthem. I looked at James, hoping for a flicker of understanding, a moment of shared history. He just raised his glass to me, a mock toast. "To freedom from responsibility," he exclaimed, and the table erupted in laughter. It was then, amidst their joyous mockery, that I felt something snap inside me. My hand instinctively went to the inner pocket of my worn tweed jacket, my fingers brushing against the crisp, rectangular outline of an envelope I had been planning to keep secret for a little while longer. But their laughter, their callous disregard, demanded a different timeline. The weight of that envelope suddenly felt like a weapon. "You know," I said, my voice surprisingly steady, cutting through their mirth, "I actually have something to share with you all." Their laughter died down, replaced by a confused silence. "A little Christmas gift, if you will." I reached into my jacket and slowly pulled out a large, heavy envelope, plain white, sealed with a notary's stamp. I placed it gently on the polished mahogany table, directly in the center, where it seemed to glow with an almost ominous light. All eyes were on it. "It concerns," I continued, my gaze sweeping across their faces, lingering on each one, "the future of this family." The silence that followed was deafening, thick with unspoken questions. James leaned forward, his usual bravado replaced by a flicker of unease. Sarah's smile had vanished. Daniel looked intrigued, while Lisa just stared, her eyes wide. They hadn't seen this coming. Not from their burden. The envelope lay there, a stark white rectangle against the festive tablecloth. A silent, unsettling presence that had instantly doused the family's earlier merriment. My heart still hammered in my chest, a frantic drumbeat against my ribs. But a strange calm had settled over me. It was the quiet resolve of a man pushed too far. I watched their faces, a tableau of curiosity, suspicion, and a hint of trepidation. They were like vultures circling, waiting to see what morsel I might drop, completely oblivious to the fact that I held the scales of justice in my trembling hands. "What is it, Dad?" Sarah asked, her voice tight, a stark contrast to her earlier effervescence. She reached for it, but I gently placed my hand over the envelope, a silent declaration of ownership and control. Her hand recoiled, as if burned. "Patience, Sarah," I said, my voice softer than I intended but firm. "All in good time." I took a slow sip of water, allowing the anticipation to build, a subtle revenge for the years of being an afterthought. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the clinking of cutlery from some forgotten plate. Michael and Emily, sensing the shift in atmosphere, had stopped their chatter and were now wide-eyed, looking from me to their parents, picking up on the sudden tension. It wasn't always like this. There was a time when my children looked up to me, when my word was law, when my presence brought comfort. After Mary passed, that started to change. Grief, I suppose, can be a lonely road, and I'd walked it mostly by myself. They were busy with their own lives, their careers, their children. I understood to a point. But understanding slowly curdled into resentment as their support became less about genuine care and more about managing my affairs, specifically my money. Every financial decision I made was scrutinized, every purchase questioned. "Do you really need that, Dad?" James would ask, his tone implying I was squandering their future inheritance. "Don't you think you should be more careful with your savings?" Lisa would add, her eyes always calculating. The most painful memory, one that still pricked at my heart, was when I tried to offer Sarah some money for Emily's college fund. It wasn't a huge amount, but it was significant to me, a gesture of love. She refused, not with gratitude for the thought, but with a dismissive wave of her hand. "Oh, Dad, don't worry about it. We're doing fine. Just keep your money. You might need it for, well, you know, your golden years." The unspoken implication that I was frail, incapable, and soon to be a financial burden on them stung deeply. My pride, already bruised, retreated further into its shell. My greatest regret was trusting them with the details of my finances after I sold the house. I had consulted a financial advisor, a young man named Daniel Chen, who seemed earnest and competent. He'd helped me manage the proceeds from the sale, investing them wisely, ensuring a steady income. But when I mentioned this to James, he scoffed. "Dad, come on. You need family to handle your money, not some stranger. Who knows what he's doing with it?" He'd convinced me to give him limited power of attorney, just to help you keep track of things, he'd said. It was a mistake I would come to regret profoundly. The next few months were a slow erosion of my independence. James and Sarah started to make decisions without consulting me, citing my best interests. They moved some of my investments, ostensibly to optimize returns, but I suspected it was to gain more control. My requests for account statements were met with vague assurances or outright annoyance. "Dad, stop bothering us with these things. We're handling it," James had snapped one evening. I felt like a child, stripped of agency, silenced by the very people I had raised. Now, as I looked at their expectant faces around the Christmas dinner table, I felt a resurgence of that old anger, mixed with a potent sense of vindication. "You see," I began, picking up the envelope and slowly, deliberately, tracing the outline of the notary seal with my thumb. "This isn't just a Christmas gift. It's a clarification. A reckoning, perhaps. I glanced at James, whose eyes had narrowed, a flicker of suspicion replacing his earlier smugness. It's about the future, and about the past. The air in the dining room grew heavy, the silence almost suffocating. My hand, despite the tremor, remained steady. This envelope contains the true story of your inheritance. I paused, letting that sink in, watching the varying shades of greed and apprehension play across their features. And it's not what you think. The confession of a dying man can carry more weight than 1,000 promises. And sometimes a hidden ledger can reveal more than any will. As I held the envelope, their faces reflected a mix of avarice and anxiety, a cocktail I had helped brew. My gaze lingered on James. His jaw was clenched, his eyes, usually so assured, now darted around the room, betraying a nascent fear. Sarah, ever the diplomat, attempted to regain some semblance of control. "Dad, what is this all about? You're making everyone uncomfortable. Is this some kind of joke?" Her voice, usually so saccharine, had a sharp edge to it. "No joke, Sarah," I replied, my voice steady, though my heart was still racing. Quite the opposite. I cleared my throat, feeling the familiar dryness return, but refused to let it falter. This concerns something I've kept private for a very long time. Something that perhaps should have been revealed sooner. I looked from James to Sarah, then to Daniel and Lisa, who were now exchanging worried glances. "It concerns your grandfather, my father, Thomas Miller." A ripple went through the room. My father was a man of quiet dignity, a carpenter by trade who had passed away almost 30 years ago. He was known for his honesty and his meticulous nature. What they didn't know, what no one knew until recently, was the secret he had carried to his grave, a secret that had inadvertently become my burden. "You see," I continued, "when Grandpa Thomas passed, he left me his workshop. It wasn't much to look at, just an old shed behind the house. But inside, beneath a loose floorboard, I found something, a small, locked wooden box. And inside that box, a ledger." I paused, letting the words hang in the air, watching their expressions shift from confusion to dawning curiosity. A ledger, meticulously kept, detailing loans he had made to various people over the years, small amounts mostly. But one entry, a very large one, caught my eye. My father, it turned out, had quietly lent a substantial sum to a struggling local business owner, a man named Robert Jenkins, who ran a small, struggling furniture store. It was a handshake deal, born of friendship and trust, with a simple promissory note. The amount was staggering for the time, easily a quarter of my father's life savings. Robert had promised to repay him with interest, but fate, as it often does, had a cruel twist. Robert Jenkins died suddenly, leaving behind a heavily indebted business and a young family. My father, being the man he was, never pursued the debt. He told me, shortly before he passed, that it was a loss he was prepared to bear. He never mentioned the ledger, never spoke of the promissory note. He simply carried the burden, silently. I found the ledger years later after his death, when I was cleaning out his workshop. I had gone to Robert Jenkins' widow, offering condolences and discreetly asking about the debt. She had broken down, explaining that the business had barely survived, and she was left with nothing but bills. I, like my father, chose not to press. It felt like blood money, born of sorrow. I put the ledger back in the box, and the box back under the floorboard, intending to forget about it. But the promissory note, I clarified, my voice gaining strength, was still legally binding. And the terms of the loan were clear. The full amount, plus compound interest, was due upon the sale of the business or property, and it was stipulated that the entire sum would pass to my direct heirs, undivided. I saw James's eyes widen, and Sarah's lips part slightly. Daniel leaned forward, his lawyer's mind clearly piecing things together. Robert Jenkins's son, a man named Michael Jenkins, eventually took over the furniture store. He's done quite well, expanded it into a thriving regional chain. A few months ago, I happened to run into him at the hardware store. We got to talking. I mentioned my father and he remembered him fondly. I took a breath, letting the anticipation build. One thing led to another and I cautiously brought up the old loan. Michael, a man of incredible integrity, looked genuinely shocked. He knew his father had debts, but this specific notarized promissory note, had somehow slipped through the cracks. He was deeply apologetic. He insisted on honoring it. I paused again, my gaze sweeping over their stunned faces. And he did. I picked up the envelope, my fingers almost caressing the heavy paper. "This," I said, lifting it slightly, "is not a Christmas gift. It's a bank draft. For the full amount, with all interest, spanning almost 3 decades. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the frantic beat of my own heart. I could almost hear the gears turning in their heads, the rapid calculations of what this meant. This wasn't some modest sum from the sale of my house. This was a fortune. And then I delivered the first part of the twist, the part that would truly shift their perception of me. And the original promissory note, the one that guarantees this inheritance to my direct heirs. I had it amended. I watched James's face contort, a sudden cold dread replacing his earlier greed. Amended by a notarized codicil to reflect certain conditions. The color drained from Sarah's face. I saw Lisa's eyes dart to Daniel, whose jaw had dropped. The envelope, now a symbol of power, felt lighter in my hand. What conditions? What had I done? The questions hung in the air, thick and suffocating. The air in the dining room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Their eyes, once dismissive, were now fixed on me, a blend of shock, confusion, and a burgeoning fear. "Amended?" James finally managed, his voice raspy, a far cry from his usual boisterous tone. "What do you mean, amended, Dad?" Sarah gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white. Daniel, usually so composed, looked visibly unsettled. I allowed myself a small internal smile. The worm, it seemed, had finally turned. "Yes, James." "Amended," I confirmed, my voice steady, almost conversational. A stark contrast to the emotional turmoil churning within me. "You see, after your mother passed and my health started to decline, I grew reflective. I started to think about legacy, about family, and about what it truly means to be a father. I let my gaze sweep over them, deliberately holding each of their eyes for a moment longer than comfortable. It became clear to me that while I had always provided for you all, perhaps I hadn't taught you enough about true respect, about genuine care. The events of the past few months had cemented this bitter realization. After the initial conversation with Michael Jenkins, I had gone to the bank, the same branch where James insisted I set up my new accounts. My intention was to deposit the significant bank draft and then, perhaps, quietly distribute some funds to my children, as I had always planned. But what I discovered there, what I overheard, had changed everything. It was a Tuesday morning, a few weeks after the Christmas Eve incident. I had an appointment with the bank manager to discuss the large deposit. As I sat in the waiting area, sipping lukewarm coffee, I overheard a hushed conversation from a glass-walled office, the door slightly ajar. It was James's voice, unmistakable, and another voice, belonging to a junior loan officer, a young man I vaguely recognized. "Look," James was saying, his tone low and conspiratorial. "My father is getting on in years. He's not always thinking clearly. We just need to make sure his funds are managed appropriately. For his own good, of course." My blood ran cold. Not thinking clearly? I clenched my fists, a wave of indignation washing over me. He's been making some rather eccentric decisions lately. Large cash withdrawals for personal projects. We just want to ensure he doesn't squander his savings. My chest tightened, a familiar pain lancing through me. I remembered those personal projects, a new, comfortable recliner for my apartment, a donation to the local animal shelter, a small investment in a nascent community garden. Each purchase had been met with a barrage of questions from James and Sarah, insinuations that I was being irresponsible. But this was outright slander, a deliberate attempt to paint me as senile and incompetent. The loan officer, sounding a little uncomfortable, replied, "Mr. Miller, as long as your father has legal capacity, his decisions are his own. Your power of attorney is limited to specific financial transactions, not overriding his general judgment." "But it should be, shouldn't it?" James insisted, his voice hardening. "He's easily swayed. We're just trying to protect him and, frankly, protect our inheritance. We've been putting in so much time and effort managing his affairs, running him to appointments. It's only fair we have more say in how his assets are handled, especially with that big payout from the old Jenkins loan coming in." My heart hammered against my ribs. So they knew about the Jenkins money. They had been anticipating it, expecting it to be theirs, and were already strategizing on how to control it. The thought of their calculating minds, their casual dismissal of my autonomy, ignited a fire in my belly that had long been dormant. My shoulders, usually heavy with the weight of my perceived uselessness, straightened almost imperceptibly. I stood up, walked directly to the glass-walled office, and pushed the door open, the creak of the hinges echoing in the hushed bank. James jumped, his face paling, caught red-handed. The loan officer looked utterly mortified. "Excuse me, James," I said, my voice cutting through the stunned silence. "Are you implying that I, your father, am not capable of managing my own affairs? Are you implying that my decisions are eccentric and that I'm squandering my money?" My gaze was unwavering, piercing through his flimsy facade. He stammered, "Dad, what are you doing here? This isn't what it sounds like." "I was just discussing options with Mr. Harrison." "Options?" I retorted, my voice rising slightly. "Options for what, James? For taking control of my life, for discrediting me to a bank official, for ensuring your inheritance regardless of my wishes?" I looked at Mr. Harrison, the loan officer. "Mr. Harrison, I believe my appointment with the manager is due. Please ensure that Mr. Miller here understands that his limited power of attorney is now, effective immediately, revoked, and that any attempt to interfere with my financial decisions will be met with legal action." I could feel the tremors starting in my hands, but my resolve was solid. The betrayal was a bitter pill, but it had also been a catalyst, a wake-up call. And it had fundamentally reshaped the conditions I had mentioned for their inheritance. Back at the Christmas table, I knew their greed would now be mixed with a potent dose of fear. The revelation of James's attempted manipulation at the bank hung heavy in the air, a poisonous cloud. Sarah looked horrified, a rare, genuine emotion flickering across her face. Daniel's eyes were wide, and Lisa stared at James, a silent accusation in her gaze. James himself was flushed, his usual bluster replaced by a defensive crouch, his eyes darting to the floor. "Dad, that's not fair," James finally mumbled, his voice uncharacteristically small. "I was just looking out for you." I scoffed, a bitter sound that surprised even me. "Looking out for me, James? Or looking out for your own pocketbook?" My chest still felt tight, but the burning indignation had replaced the familiar ache of loneliness. "When your mother and I raised you, we taught you about honesty, about respect. It seems those lessons have been forgotten." I picked up the envelope again, the weight of it a tangible representation of the power I now held. After that incident at the bank, I paid a visit to Mr. Henderson, my lawyer, a very discreet and thorough man. Mr. Henderson was an old friend, a quiet, observant man who had handled Mary's will and my own estate planning for years. I had confided in him about my children's increasing disregard, their thinly veiled attempts to control my finances. He had listened patiently, his sagacious eyes missing nothing. When I explained what had happened at the bank, he merely nodded, a grim expression on his face. "It's a common story, John," he had said, his voice low. "Children, eager for their inheritance, sometimes forget the value of their parents. But you have options. Significant options, given this new inheritance you've acquired. Together we had drafted the codicil, the legal amendment to my will, and the specific terms within the bank draft. It was a complex, carefully worded document, designed not out of vindictiveness, but out of a profound need for boundaries and a desire for justice. It was an act of self-preservation, a reclamation of my dignity. "So, what exactly is in that codicil, Dad?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling slightly. Her usual composure had completely evaporated. The image of their comfortable lives, built on what they assumed would be my eventual demise and their easy inheritance, began to crumble. "This bank draft from the Jenkins settlement," I began, my voice clear and deliberate, "represents a substantial sum, enough to ensure my financial security for the rest of my days, and then some. And the original promissory note, the one that transferred the inheritance to my direct heirs, meant it would have been split equally amongst you, my children." I paused, letting their silent calculations of potential wealth swell in the room. However, the codicil, which is now legally attached to this document, outlines new terms. I looked at James, whose face was now ashen. "Firstly, James, your portion of this inheritance, and indeed any future inheritance from my estate, has been significantly reduced due to your attempted financial manipulation at the bank and your consistent efforts to undermine my autonomy. Your share has been reallocated." I saw his jaw drop. Lisa gasped, covering her mouth with her hand. "And to whom has it been reallocated?" Daniel interjected, his legal mind kicking in, trying to grasp the implications. "To two entities," I replied, allowing myself a small, grim smile. "A substantial portion has been placed into a trust managed by Mr. Henderson for the benefit of my grandchildren, Michael and Emily, for their education and future, completely independent of their parents' control. This trust comes with strict clauses, ensuring they receive financial literacy education and cannot access the principal until they are 30 years old." I looked directly at my grandchildren, who were now listening with wide, awestruck eyes. They understood little of the legalities, but the mention of their names and the serious tone made them pay attention. "And the second entity, Dad?" Sarah pressed, her voice barely a whisper. "The second portion," I continued, my voice firm, "is allocated to a foundation in your mother's name, Mary Miller. Its purpose will be to provide support for elderly individuals who find themselves in assisted living facilities, struggling with loneliness and financial constraints, much like I have experienced. It will fund programs to keep them connected, engaged, and ensure their dignity is maintained. A legacy, in part, inspired by your mother's compassion, and in part, by my own recent struggles." The silence was profound. They hadn't expected this. They had anticipated a will, perhaps, but not a public, legally binding redistribution of wealth based on their past actions. James looked utterly devastated, the weight of his greed now crushing him. Sarah looked utterly defeated, her attempts at control having backfired spectacularly. "This isn't just about money," I clarified, my gaze steady. "It's about consequences. It's about recognizing that respect and care are not optional, especially within a family. And it's about ensuring that true compassion, not just lip service, is valued." I took a deep breath, the lingering pain in my chest finally easing, replaced by a sense of resolute calm. "The legal documents are all in order. Mr. Henderson has them, and this bank draft, which I will deposit tomorrow, will set it all in motion." I watched their faces, a mixture of disbelief and dawning regret. The festive Christmas dinner had become a courtroom, and I, the accused burden, was now the judge. And the final, most painful consequence was yet to be revealed. The silence around the table was no longer merely uncomfortable, it was charged with the raw electricity of shock and disbelief. James looked utterly gutted, his eyes fixed on the envelope as if it held the execution order for his financial future. Sarah's face was pale, a shadow of her usual vibrant self, and even Daniel, the stoic son-in-law, seemed at a loss for words. Lisa, ever pragmatic, had a look of profound disappointment etched on her features, clearly contemplating the ramifications for their own household. "Dad, you can't be serious," James finally choked out, his voice hoarse, devoid of its usual arrogant edge. "You can't just unilaterally change things like this. What about our rightful inheritance? This is a huge sum." I met his gaze, my eyes unwavering. "Rightful, James? Is it rightful to undermine your father? Is it rightful to attempt to declare him incompetent for your own financial gain? Is it rightful to treat him as a burden, as someone whose only value is the money he might leave behind?" My voice, though not raised, carried an undeniable authority, honed by years of silent suffering, and now a newfound clarity. This huge sum, as you call it, was earned through my father's kindness and integrity, qualities I had hoped to see in my own children. The physical cues were intense. My jaw was clenched so tight I could feel a dull ache, but it was a purposeful ache, not one of defeat. My hands, though still prone to tremor, held the envelope with a firm grip, a symbolic refusal to let go of my newfound control. My shoulders, once perpetually slumped, felt lighter, almost defiant. "But a trust for the grandchildren, a foundation," Sarah interjected, her voice laced with a strange mix of anger and pleading. "Dad, this is extreme. We're your children. We've always been there for you." "Have you, Sarah?" I asked, a bitter taste in my mouth. "Were you there when I spent countless lonely nights in that sterile apartment, longing for a simple visit, a real conversation, not just a rushed phone call asking if I needed anything from the grocery store, code for, 'Do you need us to run an errand while we're already out?'" I saw her flinch. "Were you there when I overheard your casual dismissal of me as a burden?" I glanced around the table, a silent accusation in my eyes. "No, you were there to manage my finances, to offer unsolicited advice about my golden years, which always seemed to revolve around how you would benefit from them." The conversation at the Christmas dinner had spiraled into a painful excavation of years of neglect and casual cruelty. The festive decorations now seemed to mock the raw emotions laid bare. I recalled countless moments, small slights that had accumulated into a mountain of resentment. The time I called James for help fixing a leaky faucet, only to be told he was too busy, and that I should just call a plumber, even though he was perfectly capable. The way Sarah would politely steer me away from conversations about my past, as if my memories were irrelevant. The forced smiles, the perfunctory hugs, the constant sense of being tolerated rather than truly loved. "There's more," I said, cutting through the stunned silence that had fallen once more. I saw their heads snap up, their eyes wide with renewed apprehension. "The codicil also includes a clause regarding the family home." I had kept this detail carefully guarded, waiting for the precise moment. This was the final, most potent revelation, the one that would truly cement their understanding of the shift in power. The family home. The house Mary and I had built our lives in, the one I had sold under their advisement. It was a beautiful colonial, nestled on a quiet street, with a large garden where Mary had spent countless hours. It was the backdrop of their childhoods, the place where they had celebrated birthdays, graduations, and holidays. When I sold it, they had been outwardly supportive, but inwardly, I knew, they had seen it as a step towards unlocking my assets. They assumed I would live out my days in the assisted living facility, and whatever remained of my estate, including the proceeds from the house sale, would eventually be theirs. "As you know," I continued, my voice gaining strength, "when I sold the house, I did so under the assumption that I was doing what was best for me and for the family. You all encouraged it, citing the maintenance, the burden of upkeep." I looked at Sarah, then James. "What you didn't know was that I had a very specific condition for its sale, a condition that was carefully documented and notarized by Mr. Henderson several years ago, long before the recent incidents at the bank." Their faces were a mixture of dawning comprehension and utter bewilderment. What condition could possibly apply to a house that had already been sold? The sale agreement, I explained, included a clause. A preemptive right of repurchase at the original sale price plus a nominal interest should certain circumstances arise. Circumstances pertaining to my personal well-being and, crucially, to the perceived respect and care I received from my immediate family. I watched their faces. James looked like he'd been struck. Sarah's eyes were wide, her mouth agape. And with the recent acquisition of the Jenkins settlement, I now have the means to exercise that right. The room plunged into an even deeper silence, a silence so profound it seemed to suck the very air out of the room. The full weight of my quiet, strategic move began to dawn on them. I was not just redistributing their inheritance, I was reclaiming my past, my home, my independence. I had been playing a very long game quietly, patiently, and now, at this Christmas dinner, the final piece was falling into place. The house, their childhood home, was coming back to me. And they, the ones who had deemed me a burden, had just lost not only a significant portion of their expected inheritance, but also the future access to the very place where their own memories resided. The final act of this quiet rebellion was about to unfold. The silence that followed my declaration about the family home was profound, a vacuum in which only the frantic beat of my own heart seemed to exist. James stared, his face a mask of disbelief, then slowly crumpled, the bravado completely gone. Sarah gasped, a small choked sound, her hand flying to her mouth. Daniel looked from her to me, a silent understanding dawning in his eyes, while Lisa simply shook her head, a grim resignation settling over her features. My grandchildren, Michael and Emily, sensing the gravity, had grown utterly still, their small hands gripping each other under the table. "The house?" James finally whispered, his voice barely audible. You're taking back the house?" It wasn't a question, but a desperate plea for clarification, for a reprieve that wouldn't come. "Yes, James," I confirmed, my voice steady, devoid of triumph, but imbued with an unwavering resolve. "The family home, the one your mother and I built, the one where you all grew up, the one I was advised to sell, for my own good, of course." My gaze was direct, unwavering. "The funds from the Jenkins settlement will cover the repurchase. Mr. Henderson has already initiated the process. By the end of January, I will be moving back." The poetic justice of it was almost palpable. They had pushed me out, convinced me to sell, envisioning a future where my assets would naturally flow into their hands. Now, the very generosity that they had taken for granted, the inheritance that was rightfully mine, was being used to reclaim the foundation of my life, the physical embodiment of my memories and independence. Sarah burst into tears, her composure finally shattering. "Dad, how could you? This is cruel," she sobbed, her voice laced with genuine pain, but also, I suspected, with the sting of what she had lost. "Cruel, Sarah?" I asked, my voice softer now, tinged with a weariness that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with emotional exhaustion. "Was it not cruel to treat your own father as a burden? Was it not cruel to dismiss my feelings, my needs, my very presence in favor of your own perceived entitlements?" I merely applied the same logic you showed me, prioritizing my own well-being and dignity. I saw Michael, my grandson, look up at me, his young eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and dawning respect. He was still too young to fully grasp the complexities, but he understood the shift in power, the quiet strength I had found. Emily, usually so boisterous, was now silent, her small hand reaching out and timidly touching my arm. It was a gesture of innocent comfort that brought a warmth to my chest, a stark contrast to the coldness I had felt from her parents. I leaned forward, my elbows on the table, and looked at them, my children, my flesh and blood, who had somehow lost their way. This isn't about punishment, not truly. It's about boundaries, it's about consequences, and it's about respect. I will always be your father, and I will always love you. But love, true love, demands respect. It demands care, not just convenience. It demands that you see me as a person, not a resource. I had the bank draft now in my hand, a symbol of my reclaimed agency. I didn't flaunt it, didn't wave it. I merely held it, a quiet testament to my resolve. The trust for Michael and Emily's education, managed independently, will stand. The Mary Miller Foundation, dedicated to supporting dignity for the elderly, will stand. These are the legacies I choose to create. Legacies born not just of wealth, but of lessons learned. Lessons about what truly matters. There was no angry outburst, no desperate argument. The fight had left them. They sat there defeated, facing the undeniable truth of their actions and their consequences. The silence this time was different. It was the silence of reflection, of dawning regret. I stood up, the weight in my shoulders finally lifting, the tightness in my chest eased, replaced by a quiet sense of peace. "This Christmas," I said, my voice resonating with a newfound calm, "has been a time of revelations. Not just for you, but for me. I've learned that a man's worth isn't measured by his dependence, but by his independence. And that true family is built on a foundation of mutual respect, not just shared blood." I walked towards the door, leaving the bank draft and the heavy envelope on the table. They could look at it, touch it, contemplate what they had lost. My peace wasn't vindictive. It was simply self-preservation. I turned back for a moment, my eyes meeting theirs one last time. "I wish you all a Merry Christmas," I said, a soft, final statement that carried the weight of years. Then I walked out of the dining room, leaving them with their silence, their regrets, and the undeniable truth that the burden had finally found his own strength and his own way home. The crisp December air, as I stepped outside, felt invigorating, a promise of a future where my dignity, at last, was my own.